Are Israelis and Americans about to repeat the same mistakes that led to the October 7th massacres? By that, I don't refer to the intelligence failures that allowed Hamas to achieve almost complete surprise in the attacks they led on communities in southern Israel, important as those blunders were. Rather, I'm referring to the belief that billions in aid and the alleged good intentions of foreign donors and even much of the Arab world would somehow convince the Palestinians to live in peace alongside Israel, or at least to abide by a ceasefire that let them control an independent Palestinian state in all but name in Gaza. It was that conviction, shared by virtually everybody from right to left in Israeli politics, as well as both Democratic and Republican administrations in the United States, that lulled the world into the sleep that allowed Hamas to strike and commit unspeakable atrocities. And if the plan for the day after the current war in Gaza ends is to bank on the same formula of international aid and a mythical pragmatism on the part of the Palestinians, then it's possible we're about to repeat that mistake. Next on Think Twice, we discuss whether the dream palaces in which so many Israelis and Americans reside when it comes to Palestinian intentions are the real obstacle to a future of peace. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Today we have an important conversation for you with journalist and think tank scholar Liel Leibovitz about what we should be thinking about the debate over the future of Gaza. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. Much of the world is up in arms about the prospect that Israel might actually finish off Hamas, much like the debate in the spring of 2024 about the possibility that Israeli forces might cut off Hamas from the Egyptian border and defeat its last armed battalions in Rafah. The notion that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will not relent in his determination to achieve Israel's war goals of eradicating the terrorist movement and freeing the hostages is seen as an intolerable escalation of the post-October 7th war. But while it's possible to question whether the IDF will finally succeed in doing what it has failed to do in the last 22 months, the pushback against this strategy has far more to do with the success of the Hamas propaganda campaign, in which so many in the West have bought their lies about Israel committing genocide or deliberately starving Palestinians. But if this offensive does achieve its objective, it's worth asking whether the formula Netanyahu's suggestion as the one to be followed the day after the war ends is realistic. As he's made clear, he doesn't want Israel to occupy Gaza indefinitely, although he isn't giving up security control. What he wants is to be able to hand over authority over civilians to a non-Israeli Arab entity that isn't controlled by Hamas or the equally unacceptable Palestinian Authority, and let it administer the billions of reconstruction funds and aid that will doubtless flow into the Strip, the theoretical moment the fighting ends. But is that really possible? Isn't this belief that the Palestinians can be bought off with aid or convinced to turn Gaza into something other than a terrorist fortress, if not another Singapore, Dubai, or a Trump-like resort, the same premise that both Israelis and Americans of all political stripes bought into before October 7th, 2023? Aren't we heading down the same garden path of belief that the Palestinians are rational actors with reasonable goals that led to the disastrous Oslo Accords and Ariel Sharon's catastrophic decision to pull every Israeli soldier, settler, and settlement out of Gaza? And will the blood libels about genocide produced by Hamas and its sympathizers have an impact on whether the Jewish state is able to even attempt to finish this war without letting Hamas survive? To discuss this and much else, we're pleased to have back with us today one of the sharpest and most insightful commentators in the Jewish world. Liel Leibovitz is a senior fellow at Hudson Institute. His work focuses on thinking about anti-Semitism as a national security threat. He's an editor-at-large for Tablet and the host of several of its podcasts. He is also the author or co-author of a number of books, including, most recently, How the Talmud Can Change Your Life, surprisingly modern advice from a very old book, and Fortunate Sons, the 120 Chinese boys who came to America, went to school, and revolutionized an ancient civilization. He also writes the regular Leibovitz at Large column for First Things and is a frequent contributor to the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, and other publications. Liel Leibovitz, welcome back to Think Twice.
What a pleasure, as always.
Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you about a recent piece you wrote for Tablet about the Dream Palace of the Jews. Now, what is the Dream Palace that you're referring to, and why did it lead to October 7th?
Well, the Dream Palace, Jonathan, is a magnificent place in which most Israelis lived until around 6:29 on the morning of October 7, 2023. And in the Dream Palace, people believed the following, that if you only gave enough international aid, enough money, enough development, enough support to the Palestinians in Gaza, then Hamas would magically disappear. How would it magically disappear? Either it would receive enough funds and realize that building, infrastructure and conducting international energy deals is way more fun than killing Jews, or the meritocratic elites, the serious, responsible, educated Palestinians who know these things much better than anyone else, would slowly take over, and Hamas would just gradually and gracefully disappear from the scene. Now, I'm being a little bit cynical, but on October 5th, 2023, that is 2 days before the attack on Enbar, thankfully, the now disgraced former head of Shin Bet presented a report to Israel's security elites in which he said, look, it is no point assassinating Hamas leaders. It is not point fighting terrorism. The only long-term solution that would work is more aid, more money, more support. Now, Bibi seemed to have agreed with this approach wholeheartedly, mainly because every single Israeli military and security official, past and present, told him this was the only path forward. The Israeli right seemed to think it would work. The Israeli left, of course, relished this approach because it got them a free ticket to Davos and other international affairs where beautiful, morally enlightened people congregate. And so literally almost every Israeli believed that all we have to do is find the correct amount of US dollars to pay the Palestinians in Gaza, and Hamas would basically transform itself, or kind of dissipate and disappear, or transform itself into the Harvard Kennedy School of Government.
I think that sums it up very well. Now, I think in that same piece, you spoke, I think, correctly about the futility of investigations of the October 7th failures, although obviously accountability from the defense and intelligence establishments, disgraced, as you rightly refer to them, as well as the political leadership, is important. But I think the question you're really posing here is not so much about what was wrong about the thinking in Israel, and quite frankly America, to the extent that Americans, Republicans and Democrat administrations had about Gaza, whether they were wrong. But this is about the day after scenarios in which everyone seems to assume that some sort of combination of foreign aid and non-Hamas administration is going to turn Gaza into something other than a terrorist fortress. Is this really the same mass delusion, or is there some reason to think that somehow that things have magically changed after 2 years of bitter warfare?
Jonathan, you have a reputation, well-deserved, for asking very sort of penetrating, difficult questions. This one is very easy. The answer is yes. It is the same freaking mass delusion as before, simply because these people don't really have a different framework. And when I say these people, I mean still the majority of the Israeli security establishment. In the recent round of appointments that Herzi Halevi, the now, again, rightly disgraced former chief of staff, felt compelled to appoint 7 high-ranking officers before departing without, again, any investigation. this was allowed to go on with no problem because these are the norms for the ruling elites. Of the 7 high-ranking officers he appointed, 5 of them are graduates of the Wexner program that brings top-notch Israeli security officials to America to learn how to think and act like, respectable Democrats. The same, as Israelis like to call it, conceptzia, the same concept, the same worldview, still is alive and well. The fact that we're even having conversations about the day after, to me, is preposterous. The day after doesn't matter. What matters is victory. And armies used to be, it was understood once upon a time, especially in Israel, that the army's sole job isn't to engage in diplomacy or worry what the editorial, in the New York Times would say about us, but simply to vanquish our enemies. Sadly, those days are gone.
Yeah, there are a lot of levels to this discussion because in part what you're referring to is something that, quite frankly, some people have been criticizing about the American military, and something that current Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says he wants to change, and that to return the U.S. armed forces to something whose job is to, break things and kill people and not as a social welfare organization. And certainly that's a problem in Israel. And you can address that further, but this is partly about the delusions of the Israelis and their American enablers, but it's also about a delusion about the Palestinians. We're still assuming that Palestinians somehow are going to be rational actors once this war is over, assuming that the war can be won, and we'll get to that in a minute. But, there's a sense, among many Israelis, no Palestinian state, we're not certainly going to let them, return to a position where they can attack us either from Gaza or from Judea and Samaria. But all the thinking about what will follow the war, because sooner or later it is going to end. I mean, it's not going to go on forever, is based on the same, I think, idea about, the Palestinians will eventually be rational, or they are rational in terms of, having something other than the destruction of Israel as their main political goal. Why do people think that?
I think that's completely correct, but there's another assumption that precedes this one, which is even more problematic, which is that Israel's war, and you would hear this said again and again and again, including by people in the Israeli government, Israel's war isn't with the Palestinian people. Israel's war is with Hamas. That is patently, absolutely, straightforwardly false. Israel's war is 100% with the Palestinian people, and we know this from the records of every single hostage who's returned and said, hey, no, we were not held by militants. We were held as slaves in homes of grandmothers and grandfathers and fathers and uncles and aunts who abused us giddily and willfully because they believed that was their mission. We know this from the numbers and the breakdown of people who came through the fence on October 7th, only a third of which, by the best estimates I've seen, were actually affiliated militants who belonged to either Islamic Jihad or Hamas or any other organizations. 2/3 were just, again, fathers and sons who, spent a lovely Saturday raping, killing, and beheading Jews. And we know this from the evidence or testaments of soldiers who come back from Gaza and say, in every home we've entered, we found at least one photo of Al-Aqsa Mosque with some kind of title that says, we will once again take Jerusalem, we will destroy the Zionist entity. We are fighting a war against a population that is hell-bent on destroying us. Now, they're not hell-bent on destroying us for no apparent reason. They're not kind of under the spell, as some of our, self-appointed intellectual and moral betters like to tell us, of some generational trauma as a result of the occupation or living in Gaza, which is truly an open-air prison, or any other of that nonsensical Western idiotic rationalization. They are pursuing a very distinct and easy to understand faith that tells them that in their midst there is a usurper, the Zionist entity, that took over some of their lands, and not only that, some of their sacred lands, and not only that, humiliated them in war. And therefore, it must be destroyed. Now, that well-meaning, educated Western liberals like to believe that we have somehow, as a species, kind of transcended the notion that people go to war over things that they really believe and that they are willing to kill and die for it, and that not everybody is the same, and that not every human being is a rational actor who just wants what's best for them and their children and wants a nicer home or better income. That is a very dangerous delusion from which we must now awake.
Well, I think that is a very important point, because assuming that Israel can actually eradicate Hamas in Gaza, or that it is allowed to do so by the world, and that is questionable, is there any reason to believe that there is a reasonable and peaceful alternative to Hamas that the Palestinians there would choose if they could? And I think you're telling me the answer is no.
The answer is no.
And if the answer is no, then what's the future of this conflict? I mean, that's the thing that people, sort of, and it's a reasonable question. There was if this is a forever war, how do, that's not something people want to think about or live with. They want a problem they can solve. And that's not just, thinking like Shimon Peres. I mean, that's an ordinary human reaction to something, isn't it?
Jonathan, I'm an immigrant to this great country. I love it with an undying passion, and I find it incredibly charming that Americans, the sort of eternally hopeful, optimistic, crew, believe that every problem has a solution. I don't think that admitting that some problems or conflicts or sort of clashes is an invitation for a forever war. It is simply an admission that we live in history. And in history, every now and then, more often than we would like to admit or we would like to believe, there are these clashes between simply incompatible points of view, masses of people, nations, etc. We still hear, Cato the Elder's kind of plea, Carthago delendum est, Carthage must be destroyed. Mm-hmm. This is the norm for humanity. The fact that we've had, as Barry Weiss likes to say, a brief vacation, a brief holiday from history, over the 90s and the 80s, and therefore came to expect that this would be the norm moving forward is simply preposterous. Now, when it comes to quote-unquote solutions, I am, again, glad, to the extent that that's the word I'm looking for, to say that the problem here, or the solution, if you will, is actually quite simple. Time, and by time I mean if you observe our region, the Middle East, since, the Bronze Age forward, you would learn that there are only two currencies that mean anything in the region. These currencies are humiliation and land. You fight a war, and if you manage to deliver a blow that is humiliating beyond the point of contestation to your enemy by taking your enemy's land, then you have won yourself not an eternity of freedom, peace, coexistence, and Purple Hearts, but rather some decades or just years of peace and prosperity. Israel is still beholden to the disastrous and genocidal Oslo mindset that holds that, eventually the Palestinians would come to their senses. Eventually they would understand that their well-being means more than destroying us. Israel, I think, now has to shake off this delusion and instead say, okay, look, we did not want this war. It is not something that we have chosen. However, since you have waged this, genocidal war against us, here's what we're going to do. We're going to seize your land, and you're not going to have it anymore, and you're not going to live it in anymore, and you're going to have yourself another Nakba that is tenfold more devastating to you than the original Nakba, which you also brought on yourself. Oh my God, says the international community, but that would mean so many tens of thousands of refugees. The answer is sure, which happens all the time in conflicts. And if the kind of from a humanitarian standpoint, if the choice is annihilation or repatriation, I think it's a pretty easy choice for any morally serious, responsible adult to make. And so I think Israel has a pretty straightforward path towards it. Now, the only question is, will it take it?
Well, I think you've laid that out very logically, and I don't disagree with it. But it's not just optimistic Americans who, think the arc of history always bends towards, progress, who are appalled by the idea that that is the solution, that this is just a zero-sum game. I think a lot of Israelis are also appalled by it, and not just, the people demonstrating against Netanyahu. I'm not sure that, there is, a critical mass of Israeli political opinion that would be willing to subscribe to what you just said. And I mean, some would, for sure. But then there's also the question, well, what does the international community, what does America think about that? What is even the Trump administration, which is as friendly to Israel as any administration is ever going to be? How will the U.S.-Israel alliance, already under fire from the Hamas propaganda war, which I want to get to in a minute, how does that survive such a, stark choice when everybody wants to believe that, even, once this war ends, that, rationality will somehow prevail?
The second part of your question is much simpler, I think, to answer than the first part, which is genuinely very complicated. I think the president made his priorities and preferences very, very clear. I think many people like to say that Trump is a sort of, loose cannon, that he is unpredictable, that he says one thing one day and another the other day. I think that's patently false. I think he's an incredibly astute observer of reality in the Middle East. I think he comes up with sort of straightforward and often inspired plans, which he did with the Abraham Accords, which no one could see coming. And he did it again not too long ago when he said, I think this strip should be emptied of Palestinians. Now, in a normal world, Israelis would have heard this pronouncement and they would have said, finally, this guy gets it. Mm-hmm. Yes, that is exactly what needs to happen, because otherwise you're going to get the same result, which we have done again and again and again. We've already given them billions and billions and billions of dollars over the years. They have done the exact same thing. They have taken the money and they have used it not to benefit their own people, but rather to continue and scheme and dream about the annihilation of the Jewish people. And so we, by which I mean to say the Israelis, should have said, hey, man, terrific. Let's come up with a plan. Instead, the Israeli government, again, I believe, deeply influenced by the pressure from the, call it the deep shtetl, the sort of security officials and other kind of enlightened, wonderful, self-appointed elites, said, no. The president didn't really mean it. The president wasn't serious. This is not a feasible plan. I still remember Gideon Sa'ar, the Israeli minister, going on every media outlet that would have him and say, no, we can't do that. Once you did this, and you basically told the American president, hey, man, we're not going to take that particular path. Once that happened, the Israelis, through, it was an unforced error, but created an entire vacuum in the American administration in which every, kind of player jockeying for power comes up with a different attitude or different approach, and that was a total disaster. Now I want to go back to the first question that you asked, which is really very, very difficult, which is this Israeli public. Look, I just came back from spending a month and a half in Tel Aviv and talking to people and sort of really doing my best to take the pulse of the country. I think it's complicated. I think there is certainly, let's begin, before we even do the political analysis, let's begin by admitting that it would be monstrous to fault any human being, especially parents of military-aged children, for wanting the conflict to end, for wanting their loved ones to be out of harm's way. We could be as sort of adamant as we want and as kind of, proud and loud and proclaim whatever, policy and political analysis that we want. But normal people just want to live on. That's a truth worth acknowledging. With that in mind, I think that Israeli society is deeply divided. I think the majority of Israelis, and if you press me to put a number on it, I would say somewhere in the vicinity of 65 to 75%, understand that we have no choice, understand that now is the time for very difficult decisions, because otherwise the hellish last 2 years would have been in vain. What we need right now is not another kind of temporary, partial deal that would give some people back and some quiet for some time, but rather a blow or an act that would change reality in the Middle East for the foreseeable future. And I think there's a sizable minority, and I'm sad to say that they include vast swaths of the people who control corporations, the media, finance, everything else that you could imagine, who still believe, who still live in the dream palace, who still believe the concept of, well, we really have no other choice except for a diplomatic solution. And I think their belief is due in very large part to what is now a completely irrational, illogical, intoxicating hatred for the current Prime Minister of Israel. Now, I am one who has not been shy about criticizing many of Netanyahu's actions, but I think that among too many in the Israeli public right now, the number one priority is not winning this war or ending this war or defeating Hamas or even securing the well-being of the state of Israel. The number one goal is unseating Benjamin Netanyahu. And I think that is a catastrophic, chaotic kind of mindset that must be resisted by any means necessary.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right on target. The one thing I'll say about this is that I worry, and I think maybe this is, analysis, maybe it's too early to do a complete analysis of how the war has been fought for the last 22 months, but do the people who run the IDF, are they prepared to do this? Or do they want to do this, just completely defeat Hamas?
The generals, no.
They don't seem to be willing to do that.
Yes.
I hear from, when I'm in Israel, I hear from lower ranking people, junior officers and, ordinary soldiers. They're ready, but, and their performance in the war has been brilliant, but it's the generals who continually seem to screw up, who don't seem to have a coherent strategy. And that's a really fair, I think, criticism of any plans, for the next phase of finishing Hamas, which we've heard from Netanyahu before. Is the IDF ready to do that?
The IDF is absolutely ready to do this because, as you noted very astutely a minute ago, the overwhelming majority of its warriors, of its soldiers and junior and mid-level officers understand precisely what needs to be done and have displayed, this is a point that cannot be made often or forcefully enough, displayed unthinkable, unimaginable, heroic courage over the last 2 years. I mean, I'm sitting with friends who have served for something like 400 days out of the last 2 years in reserve duty, have had businesses destroyed, have had families kind of really taken to the absolute limit of what is imaginable. They understand what they're doing, and they have the greatest conviction and courage and ability to go on and carry any plan. And then we get to the generals, which is a very big problem. If you're looking for a legitimate criticism of the Netanyahu government, I think one of the earliest and most profound ones has to be the fact, and it's complicated because in Israel, the prime minister is not like in America, the commander-in-chief. There is
right.
a more delicate structure. But the fact that for a decade or so in power, this situation has not been addressed, that there have still been, generation after generation after generation of senior officers who saw their role as being, basically junior members or representatives of the international community in Israel, rather than being, fierce warriors who are here to defeat their enemies and ensure Israeli security. That is a very serious flaw. All of that being said, I think that as we have seen since October 7th, the usefulness of generals is rather limited. A war like this is a sort of grueling ground conflict that relies much more on grunts than it does on, brigadier generals. And I think that once you look at how the grunts are conducting themselves, you see precisely the right spirit. I'll give you one example, and this relates back to the point I was making earlier about the importance of symbolic victories. The troops have a very innate understanding of what this war is about. They understand the religious component of it fair and square and clearly. Therefore, you've seen earlier on in the war a lot of instances of Israeli soldiers coming into Gazan territories. And the first thing that they did, they set up very, very public displays of Jewish religiosity. They prayed in Gaza. They put on tefillin in Gaza. They blew the shofar in Gaza. They shook the lulav in Gaza. They showed the entire world that they are here and proud of their religion. The IDF top brass, the generals, took extreme measures to suppress it because, God forbid, we would tell our genocidal jihadist enemies that we too have a faith that we believe in. God forbid we would answer, absolute calls to our annihilation with calls of Jewish pride and life. That shows you, beyond any doubt, I think, how out of touch Israeli generals are and how completely rooted in reality the IDF is.
Yeah, I'm reminding of American history. It took Abraham Lincoln 3 years to find a general who would actually fight
Correct.
to win the Civil War.
Correct.
Rather than just, play out the string or, blunder around. I don't know. Does Benjamin Netanyahu have another year to find another general? Does such a general exist?
I had a very kind of amusing or terrifying, depending on your point of view, evening not long ago with one of my friends who was a senior ranking officer in the American Army. And 3 drinks in, he said, tell me about the Israeli army. And I started telling him about my experience in the army. And he looked at me with his mouth wide open and said, come on, tell me the truth. You're pulling my leg. You're describing complete chaos. You're describing a reality in which, lieutenants have abilities that, colonels in the American army don't even possess. Like, right, this is a very different type of mentality. I think once Netanyahu gives a clear order, once Netanyahu puts forward a clear plan, once the soldiers in the army feel that this isn't just another example of, well, we're here because we don't really know what to do, which, by the way, is a very real frustration that Israeli soldiers have been feeling these past few years. I've had very kind of daunting conversations with, people in the level of, say, call it colonel and below, and ask them, hey, what are you actually doing in Gaza? And frequently the answer is, well, we're holding the line, but there's no real clear order, and no one has ordered us to, take it. No one has ordered us to retreat. No one has ordered us to, prioritize A or B or C. I think once the government comes and says, here's the plan, here's the rationale, go, 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 you will find a gaggle of generals who say, well, sir, this will not be, appreciated in Paris or Bonn, but you will find many, many, many more soldiers who will go out and finish the mission on the best side imaginable.
I hope so. Well, in another recent tablet piece, you write about something that I've been writing about a lot as well, and that is the way Israel is losing the culture war because Hamas propaganda about genocide and starvation has been swallowed whole by not just the mainstream media, but even some liberal Jewish groups. But I guess the question I want to ask about this, and as outrageous as the way the Hamas lies have been accepted is, was winning the information war in which Israel is fighting not just Hamas, but the corporate liberal media and its inherent bias, always been sort of Netanyahu's mission impossible? I mean, when people talk about, well, Israel's Hezbollah, its information policy has to be better, but, was this a war that could ever be won?
Yes, easily, but not the way we've been fighting. I start this piece by kind of describing the recent photographs, the harrowing, heartbreaking photographs of the Israeli hostage standing emaciated in a tunnel, forced to dig his own grave. Now, if you're a sort of rational observer, you'd say to yourself, why would Hamas, after weeks and weeks and weeks of kind of striving to convince the entire world that the bad, murderous Jews are perpetrating another Holocaust in Gaza by starving all those poor children, why would they gleefully release this photo of a starved Israeli hostage? And the answer is very simple. The answer is because that's exactly the point. We've all watched mafia movies or read, kind of mafia books.
This is sort of like the horse in the bed. The horse's head in the bed in The Godfather.
It's even more complicated than that. The thing that the mafia would do at one point or another, when your initiation to the mob is almost complete, they would force you to do something that is so blatantly evil, immoral, and terrible that it marks the point of no return for you. This is what Hamas is doing to its, foolish, useful idiots in the West. It says, look, for weeks, you have believed this narrative despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Now we ask you to look at a photo of actual starvation that we are perpetrating and ignore it. And if you do this, well, you're part of the mob. Now, that mindset, this Western mindset, is devastating. It is predicated, as I write in the piece, on this kind of, almost heartwarming, if it wasn't so kind of dangerous and delusional fairy tale, which is that all people are the same. All people are rational actors. There are no real differences between us. We all want what's best for ourselves and our children. And the only thing that's keeping the world from getting there are the ogres, the bad guys, the fairy tale kind of monsters, of which there are plenty on both sides. The Palestinians have their Yahya Sinwars, the Israelis have their, Itamar Ben-Gvirs, and if we only remove these extremists, the world will be a flourishing, Coca-Cola commercial. The notion that there are actual differences in belief, incompatible views of the world, religious desires that don't square with each other, and that these forces, clashing forces, have kind of powered the engine of history pretty much from the dawn of man, that no longer resonates in the West. Now, how do you win this quote-unquote war of information? The worst, stupidest, most kind of unimaginably idiotic way is precisely what the Israelis have been doing, which is to say, oh, no, you're not right. Here, let us show you the actual pictures of the aid trucks that we have led. Oh, no, this is not a journalist. It's a terrorist. Let us show you a photo of this so-called Al Jazeera reporter with Yahya Sinwar and Hamas. This is clearly no longer a war of ideas between two sides trying to present their facts and appeal to the kind of common sense of people around the world. This is clearly a totally different order of conversation, of narrative. Therefore, what Israel should have done, or should still do, is first of all acknowledge that this is what's going on. Second of all, stop with the futile pursuits of hasbara. And third of all, say loudly and clearly what it is that we're actually fighting. I'll give you an example. When our good friend Liel Levy was asked by, I believe it was Sky News reporter, well, does the fact that you are willing to release 3 Hamas terrorists for every Israeli hostage means that you value your lives, the lives of your people, more than you value the lives of Palestinians? Liel Levy famously raised his eyebrow and gave this very lovely, intellectual, kind of very eloquent answer to this question. What he should have said, and I don't mean to pick on him, I think he's a wonderful person doing the Lord's work, but what he should have said is, yeah, and if you don't value the life of an innocent child much more than the life of a filthy terrorist, there's something really wrong about you. Oh, Israel, you guys killed 40,000 people. It's like, okay, we don't care, because that's not a war that we started. It's not a war that we wanted. If they want to end the war, let them release the hostages first and surrender, which is how wars end. Instead, we get kind of dragged into these kind of really profoundly stupid, unwinnable conversations about, no, you got the details only more. Only a people as smart as the Jews could be this freaking stupid.
I can't argue with that. But you also seem to be saying that as long as Israel wins the real war in Gaza, as opposed to the information war, and defeats Hamas, losing the information war is bad, but it's something, the Jews can survive. But as we've seen with the Europeans and Australians recognizing a fictional Palestinian state to try to forestall Israel actually winning the real war, Hamas propaganda victories are having an impact on Israel's ability to prevail on the ground, since they strengthen Hamas's resolve and raise the pressure on Israel to stop.
I will now sound to my great chagrin, a little bit like a Leninist when I say that in this particular case, the worse it gets, the better it is. And here's why. The West is currently, but when I say the West, I mean Europe, Australia too, certainly not the United States of America. But Europe is currently facing a tidal wave of unimaginable, unfathomable proportions. Europe is currently in a state in which its population is rapidly declining. Its resources are rapidly declining. Its ability to sustain itself or play any meaningful part domestically or internationally is almost non-existent, and it is awash with millions and millions and millions of migrants that despise its way of life, and see it as nothing but a base of operations to further their own interests. Now, European leaders understand this, which is why they're being so panicked, which is why they're so quick to make absolutely profoundly moronic acts like recognizing this non-existent, cockamamie Palestinian state. Here's what I believe is going to be the likely outcome of actual Israeli resolve. Say Israel decided to go ahead, do what I firmly believe it needs to do, and take Gaza. And by take Gaza, I don't mean a sort of, Lebanon, southern Lebanon 2.0 with a Palestinian population living under Israeli military control. I mean, take Gaza and force every Palestinian resident there to repatriate somewhere else. If Israel does that, you will see massive demonstrations all over the world. You will see them in Paris, you'll see them in London, you will see them in Berlin, you'll see them everywhere. These demonstrations are very likely to further the imbalance, to put it again, very, very kind of mildly, the imbalance that these European countries are feeling. I think, for example, in England right now, there is a majority of the population that understands that they're basically under occupation because you cannot speak your mind freely, because you will be arrested if you say, hey, man, I don't like what's going on. If you said that on Facebook and Twitter, there would be people knocking on your door at 4 a.m, questioning you. And at the same time, a decades-long grooming gang of Pakistanis raping thousands of young British women is being swept under the carpet in the name of multiculturalism. And Tommy Robinson gets arrested whenever he comes back home to Britain because. Now, that is not a tenable situation. I think we're 2 or 3 or 4 massive violent demonstrations in London from the British people rising up and saying no more. We do not wish to live under Islamist occupation. We wish to stand up for our culture and our values. I think you're 2 or 3 violent demonstrations in Paris from the same thing happening in France and the same thing happening in Germany, where AfD got 24.4% of the latest election. Now, if you wait 10 or 15 years, it will be too late. There will not be anything that could be done to stop the strange defeat and downfall of Europe. Now there is. Now we still have people like Tommy Robinson, like Nigel Farage, who understand what is at stake. And you still have enough population in, marching age who could march in the street and put an end to this. And this is a conflict that we have to have. You're asking about the information war. This is something Israel can and should do. It should say to the West with absolutely no remorse or shame, hey guys, understand, we're also fighting your war. The same forces that are rising to destroy us are also rising to destroy you. That we're first in line is irrelevant because clearly you are next. The moment Israelis speak like that with courage and conviction, like, for example, when the Germans say, well, we would no longer give any, military aid that could be used against the Palestinians, the Israeli response should have been on spot. Well, okay, then we would no longer give any sort of, missile defense systems. Good luck the next time Putin decides to move his conquest, a few miles to the west and goes against you, Germany. You think we need you? Well, we don't, dying Europe. You need us.
Well, I like your optimism about Europe. I'm not sure that it isn't too late, but perhaps you're right. But let's talk a bit more about Israel and part of the political landscape, which is factoring into the decisions about Gaza, those people in Israel, including some of the hostage families, were still demanding, as they have pretty much since October 7th, that Israel end the war unilaterally in one way or another. But if that's the case, if Hamas won't negotiate and have every incentive not to release hostages, what are they talking about? Is there a rational argument for simply accepting Hamas's survival? And don't these efforts from Israelis, which are not small, basically just convince Hamas that there's no reason to give in and certainly not to release hostages?
I'm glad you qualified this question by saying any rational reason to believe. We were sitting in a cafe in Tel Aviv, Motzai Shabbos, a couple weeks ago with my wife and my children and I, and the big demonstration was marching from central Tel Aviv to the American embassy to demand the release of the hostage and an immediate deal, immediate end to the war. And my children, who are now 14 and 12, asked, well, you're opposed to this deal. And I explained why I was. And then they said, okay, so well, if you were in government, then you would vote against it. And I looked at them with kind of a blank face, and I said, I'm afraid I would have voted for it. Rationally, I understand completely why it is a very bad deal. Rationally, I understand completely why showing these horrible videos of starved Israeli hostages is a major victory to Hamas. Rationally, I would like to believe that we're all, ascendant and transcendent and could sort of push right through this. But this is not a rational question and not a rational issue. Because when we stand in shul every Shabbos and we sing Achenu Kol Bet Yisrael, we're not just saying it, pro forma. We're saying it with very real tears in our eyes and very real desires in our hearts. And so that is part of the very difficult situation we're in. I should like to think that it is the role of Israeli leadership to perform the unthinkably difficult tasks and remind us of what our national priorities are and ought to be. To date, I think the Israeli government has been reasonably good, but not great at doing so. I can never, ever judge or do anything but support, love, and embrace the hostage families, even as I understand that they're being manipulated cynically and horribly by a lot of people in Israeli political life to score cheap points against the government. Boy, Jonathan, am I glad this is not my call to make.
Yeah, it's a tragedy. But again, I don't really think we're having a rational debate, and I don't think Israelis are having a rational debate because so many people seem so determined to let Hamas survive for reasons that have nothing to do with the security of their country, more to do with politics and more to do with just some, sort of magical thinking about Israel having the power to make things happen, Netanyahu having the power to make things happen. I mean, they often, I've been there on Saturday nights in front of the Art Museum in Tel Aviv, and, people at these demonstrations, some of whom, are in great pain because of their family members being in the clutches of these monsters. But they talk about Netanyahu as if he took the hostages, if he's hiding them in his basement. They're still thinking that way.
Moreover, look, I'll give an example just from this morning. Channel 12 in Israel, one of the deep shtetl's favorite media organs, ran a quote, of course, from an unnamed senior security official, in which he said, any military action, and I'm quoting pretty much verbatim, any military action that might endanger the hostages is illegitimate and should be resisted. Now think back to Entebbe, right? The moment which we all imagine as the kind of pinnacle of successfully acting heroically, releasing hostages. First of all, there were hostages killed, Doa Bloch and I think two others during the operation. There were, of course, Israeli officers killed, Yoni Netanyahu. But furthermore, no serious actor in the government or in the IDF at the time thought that this was only feasible, possible, and permissible should we have a 100% guarantee that no hostages would ever be harmed. It is an kind of almost a form of insanity to think that that was ever something that any serious, rational person, let alone a military officer, ever thought. And yet, public opinion in Israel has gotten so heated. As you said, people are literally thinking, literally believe, and not a few in Israel, that Bibi is stopping the deal in order to further his political career. That type of madness has to be resisted.
It is madness. Speaking of madness, let's turn back to the United States and let's talk about the normalization of anti-Semitism. And that leads us to the question of what to do about Zohran Mamdani. You have written that the Jewish freakout about him is in part foolish because his victory shouldn't have surprised anyone.
Right.
And that Jews and other sane people should stop talking about moving to Florida and should instead fight for the city.
Mm-hmm.
But my question to you is, how do they effectively fight back in New York in a situation which, due to the changing demographics, this isn't the New York that Rudy Giuliani, that elected Giuliani in 1993 or even Michael Bloomberg in 2001 and 2005? How do they do that if New York may be really kind of a lost cause and, inevitably going to be electing, more people like Mamdani and, who's just a little more extreme than Bill de Blasio?
That's a wonderful question. I could start kind of unfairly by pointing out that one reason why I believe the sort of hysteria over Zohran Mamdani is overblown is because, if we're being very, very honest, though he is a truly terrible, hateful anti-Semite who would no doubt sort of make life in New York more hellish than even de Blasio did, which is saying a lot. Let us remember that the mayor of New York is not really a position with any real power. Because of the very specific intricacies of New York politics, the mayor is beholden in so many ways.
And that was true,
Always.
50 years ago and
Correct.
70 years ago, too. Not
the
just
mayor is
lately.
correct. The mayor is beholden to the governor. The mayor is beholden to the state assembly. The mayor is beholden to 1,000,001 players that he simply cannot control, not even with the most sort of blustering rhetoric. If you can imagine a situation, and I certainly can, of Mayor Zohran Mamdani having to work with Governor Elise Stefanik, you understand, inshallah, b'meira b'yameinu amen, you understand that the damage that this man could do if all other things play out right is somewhat limited. But I want to get back to the
And I would imagine the Stefanik campaign would actually might be secretly rooting for Mamdani.
If I were her,
2020,
if I were her, I would crack open a bottle of champagne that evening because, boy, there's no better ad for Stefanik for governor than Mamdani for mayor. But I don't want to just make it seem as if there's nothing else to be done. There's a lot to be done, and it begins right here at home with the insufferable and completely ineffective, criminally negligent behavior of our so-called Jewish communal leaders and organizations. Here's an example from this week. The UJA Federation of New York, one of the largest organizations and a sort of a self-professed leader of the American Jewish community, vowed to give $1 million to poor, suffering Gazans to ease their plight. The UJA gave $925,000 to Jews all over the world to improve security in synagogues and Jewish community centers. This means, if you believe, as every rational person should, that money speaks louder than words, this means that the UJA Federation values the Palestinians in Gaza, who are completely complicit in this war, $75,000 more than it values the entire international Jewish community. Kibbutz Re'im, which suffered horribly during October 7th, received $100,000. Gazans received tenfold more. Let's begin taking action by saying to our so-called leaders, I'm sorry, but your craven attempts to kowtow to Democrat opinion makers or cultural mavens or whatever it is, whoever it is you think would embrace you as part of the good, beautiful people, are not just stupid and morally and intellectually lunatic, but also actually ruinous and hurtful to actual real Jews. Therefore, we don't wish to give you money anymore. Therefore, we don't wish to support you anymore. Therefore, we wish to resign en masse from your boards and simply make it very clear that you represent absolutely nobody. And then let's take the same energy, the same money, the same kind of sense of brio that once upon a time made these organizations like the UJA, like the ADL, which has long since become a Democrat Party AstroTurf group, and build new groups, have new organizations, have new power, new people who A, organize according to their actual needs, and B, most importantly, organize around people and communities in New York who actually care about the same things as us. Here's a classic example. For the last Lord knows how many years, the JCRC of New York, the Jewish Community Relations Council, has done whatever it could to stand beside and sort of snuggle with the absolute worst Jewish haters. Hey, AOC, would you like to come on an event? Because we're ecumenical and we love you. We would issue, fierce condemnations of President Trump because that's what good people do. But AOC, you're very much part of our big tent. How about looking at other, say, faith groups in the city who believe the same things that we believe? How about standing with other political actors who are not part of the great rainbow coalition of the Democrat Party, but have real interests and real ideas and real energy behind them and going at it? And here's the most kind of wonderful thing about the numbers that Mamdani actually brought in his primaries victory. If you look at the actual numbers of the districts that voted for him, it becomes very, very clear that I don't want to say the only supporter he received, but the overwhelming, the lion's share of support that Zohar Mamdani received didn't come from working class Black New Yorkers, didn't come from Hispanic New Yorkers, didn't come from immigrants. It came from rich, privileged, overeducated, overmoneyed whites suffering terrible guilt who have all the resources that they need to sort of play act revolution. That means that there is a wonderful opportunity right now to form a real coalition of New Yorkers who are not insane, who do not wish to destroy the city by subjecting it to Marxism, who do not wish to undermine all the achievements that have already been achieved by the current Adams administration. And that's what the Jewish community should be busy doing right now. Instead, it's giving $1 million to Gaza for Hamas.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's certainly an opportunity to have sort of like a Trump-like coalition, a working class. But my only caveat is that, you said these people don't represent anyone, the people giving the money to Gaza because they've fallen prey to Hamas propaganda. I think they do represent people. They represent left-wing Jews who feel that way. I'm sure there was pressure from within their donors to do something like that. And this is sort of a Jewish psychosis, not just, it's a feckless leadership and failed organizations. And we could talk, we could speak another hour about the ADL. We both have a lot to say. But this is also a Jewish psychosis here.
You're completely correct. I apologize to you in advance for sounding optimistic. I know it is not a polite thing to do these days on a podcast, but I am very optimistic because I think if you look at the American Jewish community writ large, and I am incredibly hopeful about it, I think there is a vast number of people who had a very rude awakening on October 8th and have been kind of suffering a process of education ever since. Are there still kind of die-hard, dyed-in-the-wool leftists who would never exchange the pleasure that they receive from being embraced by the New York Times or corporate America or the Democrat Party? Sure. Is it quite a few people? Yes. Does it include people with some considerable amounts of money and influence? You betcha. But at the same time, I think there are a lot, and my gut tells me the overwhelming majority of mainstream American Jews who are sobering up to the facts, who are saying, look, I stood with every feminist cause and organization. I had my reproductive rights Shabbat at my Reform temple, and when the time came and my people were being brutally raped on camera, These same organizations didn't stand with me. I stood with the Women's March. I stood with Black Lives Matter. And then they all turned on us. I think that's the reality of most American Jews. Now, is that going to change things overnight? Absolutely not. But one thing that the UJAs and the ADLs of this world ought to realize, and I'm sure they do, is that the clock is ticking. Because if you're counting on long-term sustenance and survival of your organization, you're simply not going to have the same base because you don't represent the same things. You represent standing with the people who hate us and want us gone, not supporting and protecting the Jewish community. And I think the majority of Jews understand that. Plus, again, talk about an opportunity. I think a lot of these Jews feel themselves completely homeless. They can't be Democrats anymore. They're not, for a host of reasons, Trump supporters. They no longer feel comfortable giving to the ADL and the UJA. Where are they going to go? I think the challenge of our time is to give all these people a sense of optimism and confidence, a place to go, and a way to organize their considerable talents and resources around a cause and around a goal that could actually benefit real live Jews, the majority of us.
Well, I think that's a hopeful note. Let me just ask you one last question, and this is playing off our discussion about Mamdani. I think the question about him is not so much his awfulness, but the way the rest of the Democratic Party has not just accepted anti-Zionists and anti-Semites and their big tent, as the head of the DNC said last month, but are now adopting their positions. Lydia Polgrim in the New York Times, the other day was celebrating Amy Klobuchar,
right,
the supposed moderate Democrat, joining, the crowd voting against aid to Israel because of genocide and starvation. Is the Democratic Party a lost cause for the pro-Israel community, or do you think there's a path to defeating and marginalizing the intersectional left that seems, as Mamdani's win illustrates, seems to have all the energy and all the ideas and be in a position to basically take it over?
Man, I think the Democrat Party is not just a lost cause to the pro-Israel community. I think the Democrat Party is a lost cause to America. I think it was the Babylon Bee that put it perfectly in a recent headline. Democrats, the new kind of Democratic slogan, we hate rich people, the Jews, and hot girls. Apropos the Sydney Sweeney Good Genes campaign. If your kind of political message is we don't like America, we don't like fun, we don't like beautiful people, we don't believe that men and women, exist and are real concepts, the more loony the Democrat Party gets, the more likely it is that the Democrat Party at some point would be remade. And I think you already could see this with the popularity of people like John Fetterman or Richie Torres or people who are still, identifiably Democrats. But say what, have you gone insane? Do you actually really believe that there are 73 genders? Do you actually really believe we should support Hamas? Do you actually really believe that a hot blonde in a pair of tight jeans is Nazi propaganda? What is wrong with you people? Again, not to be a Leninist and say that we should kind of accentuate the differences, but I think the Democrat Party has a very long process of soul searching ahead of it. And rather than try to kind of stop this process by holding on to whatever we can, we should let it do its thing. We should let it undergo this kind of mass psychosis that would lead, as we have seen in 2024, would lead to catastrophic, colossally terrible losses, not just of elections, but of traditional voting blocs and coalitions that have stood firm for decades. Let that happen, and out of the wreckage, let a new Democrat Party, better Democrat Party, be born. By the way, a very similar thing is happening with the Republican Party. Donald Trump challenged a lot of the inconsistencies and incoherencies of the traditional Republican base, and as a result came up with what I think has the potential of becoming a much stronger, much more viable and valuable Republican Party. That's democracy. That's the beauty and energy of it.
Very true. Well, thanks so much, Liel. I mean, it's been great to have you back on with us again. You can follow him on X at @Liel, read him in tablet and other publications. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, which is available on all the podcast platforms. And whether you're watching us live on Facebook or X, or any of the various podcast platforms, or on the JNS YouTube channel. Please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.